everyone, so welcome back to another episode, and today we're going to go through the same thing on the chapter of coast, but this time around instead of the fundamental understanding and knowledge of coastal processes, the characteristics of waves and the different types of landforms. If you've missed out on that, then you can watch the video. I'll put the link up here, and if you have understood that, now is the time where we have to answer the inquiry question, which is, should coastal environments matter? And we will address both gateways 2 and 3, so get ready, and I hope this video will benefit you. So, are coastal environments worth protecting? Now, before we even answer this question, the first thing that we should consider would be, why is there a need to protect coastal environments in the first place? Right? Are there some significant threats that they are facing? So obviously, using what we've understood from the first gateway, we recognize that a lot of coastal environments around the world are experiencing severe erosion. So obviously, one of the threats is actually caused by natural processes, the destructive waves. They are causing coastlines to erode at a very rapid rate. And therefore, this actually poses a threat to all the infrastructures as well as the services that are along the coastal area. But apart from that, coastal environments are also facing threats from human activities such as coastal development, whereby we have land reclamation or removal of coral reefs as well as mangroves for us to actually construct new development over there that can actually benefit the local communities. But at the same time, apart from that, human activities can also come in the form of tourism. And in the chapter of tourism, you will also recognize that the rate of tourism is actually rising globally. People are traveling all over the world because it's now more accessible, and it's more affordable right now with budget airlines, etc. So with increased rate of tourism and people visiting coastal environments, negative tourist behavior can also impose a lot of threats to the coastal environments as well. And finally, climate change is something that is very significant as well. It can bring about severe changes to the coastline, such as rising sea level or the increased frequency of extreme weather events. So things like tropical cyclone, which can bring about storm surge that can cause severe erosion of coastlines, as well as increase of sea temperatures, which can actually pose a threat to the coral reef ecosystem. So one good example that you can think about would be the Great Barrier Reef. So now, recognizing that there are so many possible threats that coastal environments are facing, then it's time to answer the question of whether it's worth protecting coastal environments. And in order to answer this question, we got to think about the uses of that particular coastline. So if I say that the coast is worth protecting, it is because of the use of the coast, which actually brings economic value or other forms of value to the local communities as well as to the government. That's why the value will outweigh the cost, and that's why it is worth protecting, and that's why coastal environments matter. However, if I go on the reverse and I say that this coastal environment is not worth protecting, it doesn't really matter, it's really because of the use of the coastline. They don't have particular value attached to it because the local communities do not depend on the coast, or there are no significant infrastructure or developments at the area, and therefore it is not worth investing so much in coastal protection measures because the value is not outweighing the cost itself. Alright, so main thing to consider would be, what are the uses of the coastal area? Alright, so let me just unpack a little bit more. So for instance, if we look at local communities, we can see that coastal environments are important because they offer housing and residential purpose, or it can actually benefit the local communities in terms of job opportunities through the tourism sector or through fisheries and aquaculture. Now, in terms of how the country can benefit from the coastal environment, it can be because coastal environments will enable the country to develop economically. So through different sectors like what we've mentioned, tourism, fisheries and aquaculture. And at the same time, Governments can also benefit by reducing the need to invest in man-made protection measures, which we will go through later on, because certain coastlines are already fitted with natural coastal defenses such as coral reefs as well as mangroves. And we understand that these two they are naturally formed, at the same time they can help to absorb wave energy, which can therefore reduce erosion. So they are very useful natural coastal defenses which governments can benefit from, and they need not invest heavy amounts of money and financial resources to create different man-made engineering measures to protect the existing coastline. Now that we have understood why there is a need to protect coastal environments and whether it's worth protecting, the next question to ask would be, how then can we actually protect coastal environments? So I've written down 3 main points. Basically, they're all from the textbook. You have the laws and regulations that the government can actually implement to reduce number of damaging activities that are conducted along coastal areas, or to restrict certain developments and all that. But the main focus is actually on these 2 other measures that governments around the world are actually implementing, and I've summarized them in this separate piece of paper. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly explain it. Implementing of engineering measures come in 2 forms. First, we have soft engineering measures as well as hard engineering measures. So when we talk about soft engineering measures, you'll realize that there are 4 main categories. First, we have beach nourishment. Beach nourishment is not something that you notice all around the world because it is, number 1, very costly, and number 2, it depends on the particular use of the coast. It's usually useful for developed countries as well as countries that use the coast for tourist activities. So because it's aesthetically appealing. Alright, now next we have planting vegetation on sand dunes. This itself, we need to recognize that the vegetation is basically those shallow-rooted vegetation such as marram grass. And when we plant all this vegetation on sand dunes, first thing to recognize is not done all over the world, because it's usually implemented only on coastlines with existing sand dunes. Then governments will implement this to reduce the rate of erosion of the sand dunes, to ensure that the infrastructures behind the sand dunes are not vulnerable to the coastal processes. So one limitation that countries will face when they are implementing this would be that it requires the cooperation of the beachgoers to actually not trample on the vegetation on the sand dunes, so that it can fully stabilize the sand dunes and reduce the rate of erosion. Now the next one would also be related to vegetation, but this is actually focusing on planting of mangrove trees. Now, planting of mangrove trees is something that's very location specific, I would say, because mangroves don't grow everywhere. They're primarily found within the tropical region or subtropical region, and they're found at river estuaries. So it means that this strategy will only be applicable when the environmental conditions are ideal. Alright, next would be coral reef growth. Similar to that of mangrove trees, they are only suitable in areas where the environmental conditions are ideal. So at the same time, you also have to consider the long-term use of the coastal environment, because if the country decides to develop that coastal area and over time have plans for land reclamation, then of course this point will not stand, because it takes at least 30 years for coral reefs to fully grow into a reef structure that can be used to protect the coastline and to absorb the wave energy. Yeah, these are a couple of things that you have to consider when you're thinking about soft engineering measures. Now next we have hard engineering measures. We have seawall, gabions, groins, breakwaters, as well as tetrapods. Now each of them have their own set of use, and different coastline will require different types of hard engineering measures. Sometimes you will notice that countries actually implement a couple of the engineering measures along one stretch of coastline. So for instance, seawall itself, it is useful because it can basically reflect wave energy. But one thing to note is that they are usually costly to maintain because they are vulnerable to wave action, which will undercut the seawall at the base, and over time the seawall might not be able to hold up its structure, and it will eventually collapse. So it requires constant maintenance, and therefore it's costly and mostly implemented in the developed nations. Next, we have gabions, basically wired cages with rock fragments inside. Gabions, because of the nature of the structure itself, it has gaps in between, and therefore it helps to dissipate wave energy. It also requires constant maintenance. So even though the initial cost is not as high, but because it is a wired cage which can be vulnerable to corrosion, over time you notice that you have to replace it on a pretty regular basis. And therefore, if you think about the long-term cost, it's still rather costly. And next, we have groins. Now, groins are perpendicular structures along a coastline, and the purpose is to trap sediments during the process of longshore drift. Alright, so this itself, it's useful, however, it's only implemented and applicable for coastlines that are experiencing longshore drift in the first place. So if you have prevailing winds or the waves that are approaching the coast in an oblique angle, then it is ideal to consider the use of groins. If not, if the waves are actually approaching the coast in a parallel manner, then there's no point in using this in the first place. Okay, and it also depends on the use of the coast. So if you are actually considering using the coastline for tourism, for different tourist activities, then it might not be ideal, because you need multiple groins along a stretch of coastline for it to be effective, and at the same time it is pretty much aesthetically unappealing. Alright, so next we have breakwaters. Breakwaters, the name suggests that its purpose is to break waves. It's usually found offshore. So first of all, it depends on which kind of breakwaters you're talking about. There are structures that are completely found offshore, but there are also breakwaters that have one end attached to the main land itself. So this actually provides a nice calm zone of water, which can be used as a lagoon or for people to park their yachts. So it depends on the use of it, but what it can do is that it basically helps to break the waves and reduce the wave energy when it reaches the coastline. And if you're talking about breakwaters in terms of encouraging deposition, yes it does, but it's pretty much uneven, because sediments will be found at the back of the breakwaters. So you'll find that if the area is not protected by breakwaters, it is vulnerable to erosion as well. Alright, and lastly we have tetrapods. The key word here is that it offers immediate protection. It is precasted, and therefore all you have to do is to ship it and plonk it into the sea, and then you stack it up until it rises above the sea level, and it can absorb wave energy effectively. So usually this method is used for coastlines that require immediate protection. So for instance, if a particular stretch of coastline just experienced severe storm surge, the coastline is experiencing a very rapid rate of erosion, and therefore tetrapod will be ideal in this case, because it can offer the immediate protection that a coastline needs. So different coastal protection measures have different purposes. So you have to first consider the use of the coastline, and then you consider which out of all the different measures, which is the most suitable to use for that particular country. Alright, so at the end of the day, coastal environments, whether they matter or not, it depends on the use of the coast. Alright, number two would be if we actually say that it's worth protecting, and when we consider the things, the measures that can be taken, we have to also consider whether or not the country has enough financial resources, which is dependent on the level of economic development of the country. Alright, next would be whether or not each of these measures, they offer long-term or short-term solutions. So for instance, if a country is interested in encouraging coral reef growth, it's going to be a long-term measure. So in the meantime, if you want to reduce erosion on your coastline while encouraging the coral reef to grow, you have to implement other hard engineering measures. So that's something for us to consider. And then at the end of the day, we also have to consider whether the government has strong political willpower to implement the different laws and regulations or the different engineering measures to essentially protect the coastline. Alright, so there's a couple of things that we should consider when we're exploring the chapter of coast. So if you have any questions, do feel free to drop me a DM on Instagram or on YouTube or any platforms that you find me on, and we'll see each other in the next episode, and hopefully I will go through another chapter. Alright, see ya, bye.